Okay, so picture this. You're asleep in your home, and suddenly your spouse wakes you up scared, saying someone is breaking in. Your heart's pounding. You're trying to think clearly and find a way out. Would you just trust them? Would you follow them without even thinking?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what happened to Heidi Furkus back in 2010
Oh,
in
wow.
St. Paul, Minnesota. But for Heidi, that trust had some really, really bad consequences.
It's a scary thought, isn't it? The idea that our homes aren't as safe as we think they are. I think that's what makes this case so interesting and so disturbing. It
Right.
makes you wonder how well you really know the people closest to you and how you would react in a situation like that.
Exactly. And that's why we're doing a deep dive on this case today, looking at the 48 Hours episode, Death at the Front Door, Who Shot Heidi Furkus, and the podcast that goes with it, 48 Hours Post-Mortem. We're going to try to figure out what happened that morning, go over the evidence, and talk about some of the questions that people still have about this case.
Right. And I think as we go through all the details, it's important to remember that these were real people with real emotions, and this was a tragedy that really affected a family. So I think we should try to be sensitive and keep an open mind, but also, be a little skeptical too.
Of course. One of the first things that I found strange were the 911 calls that Heidi and her husband, Nick, both made. On the surface, they sound like a couple who is terrified and running for their lives. But if you listen really closely, you start to hear some things that don't really add up.
Right. You're right about that. Those calls are super important to the case. In Heidi's call, she's only focused on her own safety. She doesn't even mention Nick, which goes against what he said about them escaping together. And here's where it gets even weirder. There's no sound of struggling in her call, even though Nick said there was a big fight with the intruder.
Wow, that's a pretty important detail, I'd say. In a small space like that, you'd think you would be able to hear something on the call. It just makes you think that something isn't quite right.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's Nick's behavior when he's being questioned by the police, which is kind of strange, to say the least. It took him an hour and 40 minutes to even ask about his wife.
Wow, that's a really long time, especially given what had just happened. I know that the episode mentions that people from Minnesota tend to be stoic, but even with that in mind, wouldn't you say that the fact that he waited so long to ask is kind of a red flag?
It definitely is. Cultural context is important to consider, but it doesn't explain why he waited so long to ask. And it's not just about the timing, it's also how he asked the question. He seems kind of detached, like he's not showing the emotions you'd expect from someone whose wife was just hurt really badly.
Yeah, it's like he's trying to seem calm, but it sounds more like he's rehearsed it almost.
That's an interesting point, and it makes me think about another strange part of this case. Nick's money problems. When you really look into it, you find out that he was in a lot of debt and was about to be evicted from his home. But Heidi, who seemed to be really good with their money, had no idea this was happening.
I know that's what I find so strange. How could she not know about something this big, especially if she was usually on top of things?
Well, the sources suggest that Nick might have tried really hard to hide their money problems from her, maybe even intercepting mail so she wouldn't find out.
Wow.
I think the secrecy says a lot about the pressure he must have been feeling.
It is a sad thought to think that someone could feel so trapped by their financial situation that they would go to these lengths to keep it a secret. And it makes you think, could this have been a part of what happened that morning?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, financial stress can really change how people act sometimes, even making them do things they never thought they would do. And in this case, you can't ignore the fact that Nick would have gotten money if Heidi died. There was a life insurance policy worth a whole year of her salary.
Oh, yeah, that's right, the life insurance policy. That seems like a pretty obvious motive, right?
Yeah.
But then when you look a little closer, you see something interesting. Nick actually gave the insurance money back to Heidi's parents.
Exactly. That kind of throws a wrench in the whole idea that it was just about money. It makes you think that maybe there was something else going on. Maybe he wanted to protect his reputation or didn't want people to know he was failing financially.
It's sad to think that someone would feel so trapped by money that they would do something like that.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder if that could have been part of what happened that morning. Speaking of which, let's talk about the intruder. Nick said someone was trying to break in, but the investigators didn't really buy it.
Yeah, they didn't. The more you learn about that theory, the less sense it makes. Like, for example, investigators tested Nick's story that he heard someone messing with the doorknob from upstairs, and they couldn't get it to make the same sound. And let's be real, what burglar tries to break into a house at 6:30 on a Sunday morning?
Yeah. It seems like an odd time to pick. And then there's the fact that nothing in the house was packed, even though Nick said they were moving out the next day because they were being evicted. If they were really about to be kicked out, wouldn't you think they would have started packing some stuff up?
Right? It just doesn't make sense. It's like Nick's story is a mix of truth and lies, and we're trying to figure out which is which.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where that reenactment of Nick's story is so important. Investigators tried to recreate exactly what Nick said happened in the foyer to see if it was even possible. And what they found out was that his story just didn't add up, especially in such a small space.
So you're saying that the layout of the foyer and the furniture made it seem like Nick wasn't telling the truth.
Exactly. The evidence didn't match up with what he was saying. And remember, we talked before about how people from Minnesota are known for being Minnesota nice. Do you think maybe the investigators were a little hesitant to push Nick too hard at first because of that?
Oh, that's interesting. You're saying maybe they didn't want to be too confrontational because of their cultural background.
Yeah, it's something to think about. Cultural differences can affect how investigations happen in ways we might not even realize. It shows how important it is to understand the context and think about how people's behavior can influence the search for justice.
It's a reminder that there's always more to the story than what you see on the surface. Sometimes the smallest details can be the key to figuring out a complicated case like this one.
Exactly. And as we keep looking at the evidence, we meet another important person in this story, Nick's second wife, Rachel.
Right, Rachel's a big part of this whole thing, isn't she? She starts to get suspicious of Nick and decides to take things into her own hands, which ends up changing the whole investigation.
Yeah, she does. Rachel starts noticing things about Nick's money that remind her of things he's done in the past. She's so worried that she decides to secretly record a conversation with him. And during the recording, she just comes right out and asks Nick if he could lie about killing his wife.
And his reaction to that question is seriously creepy.
Yeah, you can say that again. He just goes silent, which says more than words ever could. He doesn't deny it right away or try to say she's wrong. It's a moment that gives you chills and makes you question everything you thought you knew about this guy.
It's amazing how sometimes what people don't say is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than what they do say. That silence, that inability to just say, no, I didn't do it, makes it seem like he's guilty.
Exactly. And that recording becomes a key piece of evidence and makes everyone even more suspicious. Eventually, all of this evidence, all the different pieces of the puzzle lead to a big showdown in the courtroom.
Man, that trial was something else, wasn't it? The courtroom was packed full of people, which shows you how much this case affected the community. People were split. Some thought Nick was innocent, and others thought he was guilty.
It shows you how personal these cases can get and how they make us think about things like trust and justice. And even when he was being sentenced, Nick said he was innocent. His dad even begged anyone who knew anything about the real killer to come forward.
It's heartbreaking to see a family fighting so hard for their loved one, believing he's innocent, even though there's all this evidence against him. It makes you wonder how far people will go to protect the people they care about.
Yeah, it does. And it makes you ask, is their belief in Nick's innocence real? Or are they just trying to make things seem normal after such a horrible tragedy?
That's the big question, isn't it? When we look at all the evidence, all the twists and turns in this case, it comes down to this. Do we believe Nick or not?
Yeah.
It really makes you think, even after the trial is over and everyone goes home, do we believe Nick? And if not, what really happened to Heidi that day in St. Paul?
It's a question that stays with you and makes you think about what you believe about truth and justice and the people you think you know. It's a reminder that even in places that seem perfect, bad things can still happen.
Yeah.
And that we need to be careful and think critically, question what we hear, and look for the truth.
Exactly. We can't just accept the easiest answers we have, to be willing to think for ourselves and consider that maybe even the people we're close to could be lying to us.
And as we think about this case, it's important to remember that even though the trial is over, everyone involved is still dealing with the effects of what happened. Heidi's family lost their daughter, their sister, their friend, and Nick's family is dealing with him being found guilty while still believing that he didn't do it.
It's a reminder that there are no winners in cases like this.
Yeah.
Just a lot of pain and unanswered questions.
And even though this case is closed, the search for answers and wanting justice never really goes away. There are so many other stories out there, mysteries to solve and people who need to be heard.
So as we finish up our deep dive into Heidi Furkus's case, I want to leave you with this. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong or if a story doesn't make sense, look into it, ask questions. Don't be afraid to question what you're told.
Because finding the truth, even if it's hard, is always worth it. Sometimes the things that make us uncomfortable can help us understand ourselves, our relationships, and the world better.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. We don't just scratch the surface. We go deep exploring the complicated parts, the things that don't make sense, and the questions that are left unanswered. And we hope that by doing that, we can help you understand the world a little bit better too. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.